Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm your regular host, Captain Todd Lamper, but today I have another regular co-host. My regular co-host, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young. We're going back to, suppose, we've done a number of episodes, and if you haven't listened, definitely go back and have a listen to them. But we talked about mobilisation, and then we went through sort of the Japanese thrust, so through Singapore and one of the most audacious enemy advances history, in through Singapore and then down into the Pacific. Then we went into the micro-tactical ball, and in the episode's called Invasion Rabaul. Definitely go have a listen. But talking about the hyper-tactical components of the Japanese advance onto Rabaul and the waiting Australian forces trying to delay that enemy as long as they could, but we went into some graphic stuff. I think the next logical step is to talk about an attack on Australian soil, which is the next in the sort of order of battle, but it seems only naturally to progress to Darwin, to talk about Darwin. So welcome back, sir.
Todd, thrilled to be here again, and I agree with you that this is a perfect way to continue our story, specifically looking at some of the decision-making on both sides about Australia as a potential base.
I think that decision-making is important. We ebbed and flowed when we were trying to create this episode about starting with Darwin or starting with the enemy situation more broadly. And I think that's a better place. We landed that is a better place. So can we talk through, noting that we've just gone through the big Japanese advance down into the Japanese thrust, and then we've just talked about Rabaul, which was one of the bird forces, and the difficult and trying times they faced on Rabaul. I suppose from there, what did the Japanese do, and more broadly the coalition as a starting point for lack of a better term, the situation enemy general?
Yeah, so I think it's worthwhile to start with understanding that the Japanese construct, the Japanese Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy had primacy throughout the Pacific, while the Imperial Japanese Army had primacy in the China campaign. Now, there was crossover with both services supporting, but there was also massive inter-service rivalry. The key arm for the Japanese Navy, the key strike arm, was their aircraft carriers, a force called the Kido Butai. There's going to be a lot of Japanese pronunciation from me.
Flawless pronunciation.
Look, I spent a week in Japan last year with my tutor, Lara Perkovic. So, yeah, she'll be impressed with some of my Japanese skills. So the Kido Butai, what was it? The core of it was 6 aircraft carriers. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Zukaku, the Shokaku, the Hiryu, and the Soryu. It's worth pausing just and looking at those actual ships. So we are talking ships that can take somewhere between 65 and about 90 aircraft. That's comparable in terms of number of aircraft to a Nimitz aircraft carrier today. They could also, the slowest of the ships was the oldest, the Kaga and the Akagi. They could go around 28 knots. But the newer ones, the Shikaku, Zukaku, the Hiryu and the Soryu, they could make 34, 35 knots. To put that into perspective, the Hunter frigates that we are building and that should launch in the early to mid 2030s, they are planned to have a maximum speed of 27 knots. So this is a fast strike force capable of hitting anywhere in the Pacific in an unexpected manner. So that's what we're actually dealing with. I think it's interesting to understand that, because looking at the voyages of that force through that first few months of the war gives us a nice approximation to what the Japanese considered their main effort to be.
Yeah, I was just about to say that speed seems to be the main effort. We talked about an audacious advance being the Japanese thrust. Speed seems to be that main effort and design of battle, I suppose.
Yeah, 100%. And so December 7th, 1941, all 6 carriers strike Pearl Harbour, and there's many better podcasts and books on Pearl Harbour, so we won't go into what happened there. But the fleet then it splits a little, but the other operations that it supports through those early months. First of all, it goes to Wake Island, where a group of US Marines famously repel the first Japanese assault, and when asked what do they need, they respond, "Send more Japs." Well, the Japs did indeed send more Japs, and it didn't go very well. But part of that was elements of the Kido Butai striking Wake Island on the 21st through to the 23rd of December, and actually took Wake Island to form part of that perimeter for the Japanese that they were seeking. Strategic depth is what they were seeking. They then returned to Japan in December, but through early January, those 6 aircraft carriers start forward deploying to Truk, which is in the centre of the Caroline Islands, which is now Micronesia. This is Japanese territory that was ceded to them after the First World War by Germany, and they built a large naval force projection hub at Truk to be able to facilitate this. Now, that takes us through until mid-January. Okay, so Kido-Butai is sitting in the middle of the Pacific waiting for the next stage of operations. Okay, so at the same time, let's now flick to the US and consider what's going on from the US point of view. So what did Pearl Harbour mean for the US? I think the key thing is that the striking of Pearl Harbour and the disabling and sinking of the Pacific Fleet battleships meant that the plans that the US had prior to the war, War Plan Orange was their Pacific War Plan, it was immediately thwarted. So the very broad brush idea, and the plan was revised like 9 times in the 15 years before the war, but the very broad brush was that they accepted that if there was a war against Japan, the Philippines would be struck and probably taken, but that essentially the Navy would ride to the rescue across the Pacific through the central islands of the Pacific to retake or support the Philippines. That was the broad brush plan. That was immediately thwarted, which means that you then enter a period of improvisation with the US and the Allies essentially trying to assess what bases can be held against this first Japanese assault. And, eventually they think it'll run out of steam, as all assaults do. Where will that be? What can we hold? So if I can just take a quick aside here, what we see there is that the pace of the Japanese thrust threw everything into turmoil. So the warning time that they thought they had completely evaporated in a moment. And with it, sank their ability to counterattack.
Just put them straight on the back foot, I suppose, and then Vance kept going and further, and that warning time that they would otherwise have assumed that they had just evaporated.
Yeah, so I think a warning time is a theoretical construct, and maybe we need to think about that a bit more ourselves. Okay, so they're trying to hold bases, or they're trying to work out where they could mount defences throughout the Pacific, and in the 10 days after Pearl Harbour, General Eisenhower, who's currently on staff in Washington at this point, he identifies that Australia needs to act as a rear base for logistic support to the Philippines and also to the Dutch East Indies. So this is 10 days afterwards, pretty quick time, and their broad plan is that they will ship stores to Brisbane and Sydney and then transport them overland to Darwin before they send them forward to the Philippines by air and also by sea, although they're not thinking, they're thinking blockade runners up to the Philippines. They're not thinking just a whole lot of merchantmen just sailing up through the Dutch East Indies at this point. Dutch East Indies is what we would now call Indonesia. So this rough plan was called Plan X, and the important thing to note is that none of the planners in Washington had ever been to Australia. So they didn't have an understanding of what Australia looked like.
That's what I was just about to say, that like sort of flippant remark of just moving stuff inland or around the coastline from Brisbane and Sydney to Darwin is like, obviously we know that is not the case. It's not easy, incredibly difficult. And just to get those, I suppose the aim is to get the stores closer to the Philippines. Is that correct? Yeah,
look, 100%. And essentially they've looked at a map and they've seen that Australia has a port sitting there in Darwin. It's a capital city-ish. Yep. Great. That looks like it will be an excellent logistic hub for operations up into the Southwest Pacific.
Now, when you say capital city, like I don't want to jump forward because we'll talk about Darwin in a second, but like how big is Darwin at this point? Capital city now, it's 140, 150,000 in the last census. Like what are we sort of looking at in terms of capital city, if you use that?
It's a small city of about 5,000 people. It does have a deep water port. And it's got an airbase that's being built up, but its lines of communications to it are very, very sketchy. There is essentially a ship coming out of Broome, and then another ship that's coming out of Townsville and Cairns that are on about a fortnightly loop that is supplying the townspeople with what they have. Not much is coming overland at this stage. And in fact, do you know what? There's a really, as a brief aside, I just want to grab hold of this part of the problem, right? And talk about what I have observed as a logistic planner in how Europeans view Australia and also how the Americans. So my observation, and this is an observation of recently, is that Europeans struggle to grasp the distances involved in Australia. And so to give that some figures, southeastern Australia to Darwin is the same distance as the crow flies as London to Moscow. Now, if you then go by road, and this is today, not 1942, this is today. If you go by road from southeast Australia, the winding route that you need to take is the equivalent of starting in London and ending up going through the Channel Tunnel, and you end up in Tehran. It's big, and Europeans struggle to get that.
Yeah.
Americans get the distance. They completely understand. What Americans seem to struggle with is the remoteness of in particular the Northwest Shelf. So, I've sort of trialled a few different ways of trying to describe it. The most effective ones that I think I've come up with are things like, okay, so the northwest of Australia is the same landmass as Texas, Nevada, and California, with the population of Anchorage, to try to sort of articulate that this doesn't look the same. The other one that I think is really interesting is if you have a look at a satellite photo or a composite photo of Australia by night versus the US by night. Like a lot of people would have looked at the one of South Korea versus North Korea. Well, the northwest of Australia is kind of a bit more North Korea than South Korea. That problem still exists today, and it existed in 1942, where US planners would see a dot on a map and assume that behind that, all of the railroads of, say, the Pacific Northwest existed in Australia, and they just didn't.
Yeah, I think
at the time.
your point about the same assumptions back, or the same facts back then are exactly the same now. Like we talk about, I'll put it out there. I absolutely love Darwin. I want to go back and post there. But it is like nowhere else. Having been to Townsville a number of times and then going to Darwin, it is far more remote. And I think as evidenced by each time you post in, you can be without a car for 3 months for the first part of the year, as flooding blocks off the only arterial road and railway up to Darwin. Like it is far more remote than you would think. And I think that's, you're trying to make that point as well, but it's still current today that is the case.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so that's the plan the Americans have come up with. They send a planning team out to Australia that arrives in January of 1942 to make this plan come into action. At the same time as that, General MacArthur, who is sitting up in the Philippines, he has decided that he needs to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. And basically ride out a siege of the Japanese. As part of that, he withdraws his air force to Australia and Darwin. So we have his air commander, a guy called General George Brett, landing in Australia with the task of establishing Australia as a viable, secure southern flank for US operations going forward. So you've got a planning team coming from Washington, and you've got General George Brett coming in from the Philippines to make all of this happen. And they're your two sort of people. Now, the plan is pretty quickly, this is all now happening in January of 1942, they realise that there is a significant problem. The US Army official histories describe Australia as a thin rim of seaboard settlement enclosing a vast wasteland sprawled over the central portion of Australia. And it's probably pretty true, right? There's another quote here that the planning team, again from the official histories of the US Army, with the best will in the world, Australia simply did not have the resources for the tremendous effort required. Australian manpower, scant to begin with, had already drained from her military forces and war industries. Her continental defences were at rock bottom, the best of her troops and the bulk of her military equipment having been sent overseas. Her economy was already stretched tight by the demands of 2 years of war and was scarcely sufficient to meet her own requirements. While a large part of the basic US Army ration, items of clothing and the like, could be obtained locally, only a brief survey was needed to convince Americans in Australia that the great bulk of military supplies, including construction, equipment and construction labour, would have to come from the United States. So that's a situation that they see almost immediately. But the thing is about wartime and about, I guess, generals and military officers, full stop, is that we've all got kind of a can-do attitude. And so the US, General George Brett, he starts to actually plan, okay, well, how am I going to, in his words, turn this into a second England? He thinks that's what his task is, to create this piece. And he actually goes down to Melbourne, to Victoria Barracks, and he briefs both the Australians and also General Wavell, who at the time is the ABDA commander. I think we spoke about ABDA briefly in one of the previous episodes, about his broad brush plan that he's going to build a chain of roads, air bases and logistic nodes from Brisbane through Townsville to Darwin in order to realise this vision that the Washington planners had. He thinks it's a gold plan, evidently.
And I think if you've driven the Stuart Highway from Adelaide to Darwin, you'll know that's quite developed now and all that sort of stuff. But if you've driven from Townsville to Darwin, you'll realise that it's not very well developed either. And there is large expanses of that. There's periods where you go without fuel for long stretches of roadways still. And I mean, we're in 2025 now. So that, if you think the Stuart Highway was, and my argument before was that you will still get delayed on the Stuart Highway on the rail network. If you come from the east across from Townsville, it is way worse. Like it is, not developed in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, 100%. It's Australia. That's what it is. Okay, so General Brett, after briefing the Australian government and the ABDA commander on his plan, he writes back to Washington. His planners have done good staff work, and he's come up with a list of things that he needs. The first thing is, and I'll just read the list actually. So he needs experienced air supply logisticians, because he's thinking that he needs to project air power from Australia. He's asking for 4 regiments and 4 battalions of anti-aircraft troops to secure the air bases across northern Australia. 2 air warning service organisations, so think radar. That's what he's asking for. 180 barrage balloons and associated personnel. 2 mobile air depots, so that is air maintainers and all of their equipment. 3 engineer battalions, for the construction of both roads and also air bases. A general service regiment, so I think GDs, probably Negro labourers in this case. 3 engineer aviation companies, 100,000 tonnes of asphalt, 30 asphalt producing plants, rock crushing plants, jackhammers, explosives, landing mats, and for transport then a whole series of rolling stock, gasoline storage tanks, trucks, and also associated personnel.
I think that the link to a previous episode is that we always ask for everything we want. I suppose when we're talking about Rabaul and not getting the defences that you need, well, let's talk about Darwin. He asked for all these things. What did he actually get? Yeah,
so so this is cabling, right? This is telegrams back between him and Washington, and Washington are shocked, and they write back to him and say, revise your list and tell me what's absolutely necessary. General Brett doubles down and basically just puts in necessary. The same. This is the minimum in Australia. And look, Washington essentially come back to him and say, cool story, we're going to be invading North Africa later on in the year. You're not getting really any of this. Make do with what you can, with what the Australians can provide. And that's basically where it's left. And Brett, from the official histories, appears shocked with the disparity between the task that he thinks he's been given and the resources that are available for the task. Again,
echoing the same comments we've made in the past.
100%. So now the interesting thing is, though, that the Imperial Japanese Navy, they make a really similar assessment to the US about the importance of Darwin and the US planners, because they look at it and they see that it is a critical port that can influence their operations in the Dutch East Indies in particular, and that becomes important for them for their next phase of operations through that area, their next stage of their thrust.
I think that over-exaggeration about the importance of Darwin or the size and what it can offer is like on both sides is obviously relevant. I think it's important to talk about Darwin in 1941 now, so that we can, the 1940s, I suppose, by way of me contributing for a ground brief.
You're our resident Darwin expert, because I've done about 4 weeks there in my career, mate. So you got to go Darwin. But so what was it like in 42?
Yeah, I suppose if we talk about Darwin now, for people that have posted out there, all the service residents are out at Palmerston, and there's up to Nightcliff, all this sort of sprawl, and we talked about it being 140 to 150,000 in the last the census. But if we go back to the 1940s, we're talking about basically 4 streets. We've still got Kavanagh, which everyone will know, Smith Street, Mitchell Street, everyone will know Mitchell Street, and I'll use that as somewhat of a navigation aid to talk me through the ground brief. But then the Esplanade
what's on Mitchell Street?
I'll talk 2 seconds. But like, the only wharf that we have is Stokes Hill Wharf, so everyone will know that. They'll look out from the precinct or Hot Tamale, or some Mexican restaurant down on the waterfront there. They'll look out to Stokes Hill Wharf, and it wasn't as big as what it is now, but that was the only sort of port, and then a number of ships afloat out in the Darwin Bay there. And I suppose we come back up Mitchell Street, and we got Hotel Darwin. Current Hotel Darwin is not as it was back then, but it's still on the same site. And you're basically punching through Mitchell Street, monsoons on your right-hand side, shenanigans on your left, and you're going to turn sort of left at Smith Street. Just as you proceed on your e-scooter towards Lola's Pergola, you're going to see on your left-hand side is where the old hospital was. So the site is still there, the old hospital is not. But Larrakeyah is basically brand new. It's the army barracks there, the only army barracks there at that time established, and it is less than 10 years old. And same with RAAF Darwin. It has only just been established. So Darwin is in its absolute infancy. If we continue on our tour and we go up past the casino, and just east of the Trailer Boat Club was where the civilian airport was. There's still a Qantas hangar there, and it's now a museum, but that basically, Parap as a suburb is now on top of that airfield, so it no longer exists, and the civilian airfield's moved out to RAAF Darwin. But we have, so I suppose to summarise, we have RAAF Darwin as it is now. We have a civilian airport, which is now where Parap is as a suburb. We have Larrakeyah as it was, but a brand new base. There's a hospital just near Lola's Pergola before you get into Cullen Bay there. And then 4 streets and 1 wharf is basically what Darwin sort of offers at this point. So that the Japanese and American exaggeration about how critical it is may have been overstretched by the fact that it is a minuscule, it's already quite a small capital city, very remote still, and then subsequently was significantly smaller than it was. We still have oil and fuel tanks, and you'll be able to see them down, not on the Stokes Hill Wharf, but just back up towards Bayview area, which Bayview wasn't even a suburb at the time. And we're getting to a point where we're thinning down to about 2,000 civilians living there when the threat looms, and we'll get into the threat in a minute. But I suppose that's what Darwin looks like now.
Yeah, it is genuinely a tiny place, and I think that remoteness and the small size of it, you can get into an argument about what the capacity is to provide logistic support to things, and if we want to link it to today, then we also need to think about, okay, so in our civilian society, how much capacity is there to actually assist in a military effort that isn't being used for something else right now in civilian society? Is there much latent capacity? I think it's pretty arguable. Business doesn't hold latent capacity because it costs money to. So where you need to build up an area for defence reasons, it's an insurance policy. And I mean, those fuel tanks have only been built in the last few years, in the 1930s in Darwin's case. And same with the with RAAF Darwin having just opened. That is defence building it for security reasons, not commercial interests.
Yeah. Holding capacity.
Because why would you? It just costs money to hold capacity. So I think there's probably a lesson there for us today as well.
And then just I think the supply line. So when we transit from Robertson Barracks now down to Coltana, it's still a 5-day drive. I think 5 days on either side, so it adds about 2 weeks onto a field exercise. That drive all the way down because it is so far. There's a popular Netflix documentary called Last Stop Larrakeyah, but Larrakeyah is one of the towns on the road down to Katherine. Just past Katherine. But basically, there's a number of, talking about rail network not reaching all the way to Darwin and them having to go on gravel roads for that last component. And I say last component, it's a long stretch, but stopping in these outstations, which are relay. Larrakeyah has a relay station and subsequently soldiers were staged there to be able to infill. But this was a huge effort to get anyone up there or anything up to Darwin.
Yeah, absolutely. And pretty quickly, the US and also the Australians realised that that overland idea is not going to work, and actually, it's going to need to anything going to Darwin needs to come by sea. But that also incurs unloading delays because you've only got one wharf and massive tidal ranges. So you end up in this problem where something looks great on the map, but you start scratching the surface and looking at how do I actually make this happen? Those, captains, majors and warrants on the ground trying to make this stuff happen that General Eisenhower back in Washington has gone, geez, Darwin looks good to support the Philippines.
And hasn't been able to do the reconnaissance because, again, waiting time evaporated. So, warning time evaporated, sorry. So, no planning time, zero reconnaissance, picks a point in a map. They both do, Japanese and US, and then go, let's make it happen. It's like, we actually can't. But anyway, yeah.
Correct. Okay, so look,
let's go back to the enemy, I suppose.
Yeah, let's jump back to the enemy. Okay, so we left the Kidu Butai and their aircraft carriers in Truck Lagoon, an idyllic place in the Central Carolines in mid-January. In late January, then those carriers split. So 4 provide cover to the invasion of Rabaul, and we spoke about that in the last episode. So 4 aircraft carriers go for Rabaul. The other 2 carriers actually join in the assault of Gull Force in Ambon, which we covered two episodes ago. So that's what those aircraft carriers are doing. But then the next thing that they look at is Darwin, and they decide that in order to provide the invasion of the Dutch East Indies with time and also strategic depth, they're going to strike Darwin and take it away as a hub to force project for a period of time. So they've identified Darwin as a hub, and so they decide to strike it with 4 of the aircraft carriers of the Kidu Butai: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Hiryu, and the Soryu. And they strike it on the 19th of February, 1942. That is 74 days after the attack on Pearl Harbour on the 7th of December 1941. So I want you to just think about what you were doing 74 days ago and then consider that in that time, Pearl Harbour's been struck, the Philippines have been invaded, MacArthur's withdrawn to the Bataan Peninsula, Malaya, has fallen, Singapore fell about 5 days before this, the Dutch East Indies has been invaded. Rabaul has fallen. There's 1,500 Australians on the run there. Gull Force has folded completely in Ambon, and Sparrow Force in East Timor is essentially starting to conduct a guerrilla campaign, trying to figure out what exactly they're going to do. Not a lot of good news there, and both the British and Australian and also the US strategy has been completely upended by an adversary, and that's where we're at on the 19th of Feb 1942. So this force that the Japanese strike with, it's called the Nagumo Force after the admiral, and the Nagumo was the same guy who was the admiral for Pearl Harbour and Midway in the end as well. Now I don't think we can add all that much to the actual strike on Darwin. There's been a lot of books written. There is significant controversy around it. what I want to talk through is just quickly the results or the very broad brush of what happened. So it was struck with 242 planes from that Japanese force. And the results were that around about 250 Australians and Americans were killed, 300 to 400 wounded. Those figures are contested, but we won't get into that. Contested as in some people feel that it was significantly higher. I'll leave that there. 30 aircraft were destroyed, some of them in the air, some of them on the ground. 11 vessels sunk. Most of them were sunk. Sorry, most of them were merchantmen, but a lot of them were also evacuees out of the Dutch East Indies in the face of the Japanese invasion there. 25 of them were damaged. Now, you mentioned to me that there was a series of coast watchers who were strafed. Do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, I suppose only because we're sort of centering some of our exercises back on the Tiwi Islands, that being Bathurst and Melville Island to the north of Darwin. But we've got coast watchers out, and I've just hit up an old commander of RFSG, and we'll talk about the coast watchers and the history there if he's willing to come on. But I've just thrown him under the bus just then anyway. So, but yeah, coast watchers are up sort of on Bathurst Island in the same places that we're currently infilling in for exercises in one brigade and getting strafed by and absolutely destroyed as part of that assault coming down to the north. But yeah, Melville, the Tiwi Islands more broadly, but Melville and Bathurst are very much in the direct line of this advance through into Darwin.
Yeah. So again, echoes there. Geography doesn't change. I want to read to you what Mitsuo Fushida said. Now, he was the commander of the airstrike on Darwin. He was also the commander of the air element that struck Pearl Harbour. So this is a very experienced guy. He actually did survive the war and spoke about these things quite a lot. This is a quote from him after the strike on Darwin. "The job to be done was hardly worthy of the Nagumo force. The harbour, it is true, was crowded with all kinds of ships, but a single pier and a few waterfront buildings appeared to be the only port installations. The airfield on the outskirts of town, though fairly large, was no more than 2 or 3 small hangars, and in all there was 20-odd planes of various types scattered about the field. No planes were in the air. A few attempted to take off as we came over, but they were quickly shot down, and the rest were destroyed where they stood. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, but largely ineffectual, and we quickly accomplished our objectives." So I think there, what you see is that the intelligence picture for both the Americans and Japanese, looking at a point on the map, did not necessarily match the facilities that were in Darwin itself. Now, after the raid on Darwin, throughout 1943 and 1942 and 1943, there's another 100 raids. But these raids are conducted largely by land-based bombers flying out of Timor and other areas in the Dutch East Indies, or the occupied Dutch East Indies. So, in other words, the Japanese no longer saw Darwin as being on their main effort. There was other things to focus on. Now, the Allied navies pretty much abandoned Darwin at that point. And the build-up that occurred then through 42, 43, and indeed 1944 was focused on providing a hub for air projection and also air defence. But the end result is that Darwin isn't used for a single large-scale amphibious operation, either to mount or sustain it throughout the war, even when in 1945 we go into Borneo and the planned invasion into Singapore. They are mounting out of Morotai and islands to the northwest of New Guinea, the island of New Guinea. So Darwin is the problems of remoteness are just too great to be overcome. Plus the fact that they're in strike range of the Japanese forces in the Dutch East Indies mean that Darwin simply isn't viable.
Mm. Yeah. I think to put it at go back to that hypotactical level, we're talking about aircraft trying to take off, and your quote from the Japanese general talks about aircraft taking off from RAAF Darwin only newly established and tracking sort of out to the east. and basically being shot out of the sky into Arnhem Land, which if you land, if you're able to get onto the ground or like in some way, shape or form get to that point, there is no way of getting back anyway. You are in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It's still that remote, and it was way more remote back then as well. But I suppose that's the exaggeration of its importance from the US and Japanese allocating sort of like the main effort to Darwin and then being surprised, sending 250 odd aircraft to destroy 20-something aircraft and some ships floating in the, I'm not flippant, but I'm saying some ships in the Darwin Harbour. Like it sounds like a huge sort of lapse of judgment or misunderstanding about. I mean, if you're moving that quickly, that warning time, just the time for reconnaissance and planning and stuff just evaporates, and maybe that's why we come to these assumptions. But I suppose if we zoom back out, because I went to the hyper-tactical level, but if we zoom back out, what were the sort of key takeaways for Darwin?
Yeah, so I guess so. If you're a Japanese officer trying to defend the assault on Darwin, then what you are saying is something like, look, because that initial attack was so devastating, it meant that the Allied thinking around Darwin changed, and that Darwin was no longer seen as a viable hub for force projection into the Dutch East Indies. So that would be the positive, and it's partly true, but I think probably the remoteness of Darwin would have led to that conclusion regardless.
So I think the assumption could have been cleared before sending 250 aircraft. Is that sort of the argument that you're making? Well,
yeah, but that is the argument that I'm making. Although there's no satellites, and I'm reminded of the fact that I think this may be apocryphal. I'm not sure, but if we look at the midget submarine raid on Sydney Harbour in May 1942, I think that the only map that the Japanese had was like a street directory page out of a Sydney street directory, and that's all they had. And it was like it was not necessarily the harbour; it was like the southern part. So intelligence pictures are not necessarily the best in 1942. The Americans faced something similar when they went into Guadalcanal with no actual maps of the island of Guadalcanal. We'll just go and dead reckoning it, and we'll work it out as we go, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's entirely surprising that they didn't know exactly what was there. Although they were very good at sending like reconnaissance seaplanes over things to have a look, and they still saw that it was a viable place to assault. So I guess thinking about this, my other takeaway, and I reckon this is actually something for you to answer, is if we accept that staging operations from remote places is hard, as I think this is probably demonstrated, what's changed with Darwin now?
I mean, I can't. It's still as a remote. I mean, we still have that difficulty, and there are no furniture shops up there. There's a couple of furniture shops, but basically the supplies and stuff are still incredibly difficult to get to Darwin, right? So we know that to be true. I don't think, it was, it dropped to 2,000 in its lowest point for when most of the civilians evacuated, when the threat was looming, but 140 is still not that large. Still in the middle of nowhere. I talked about the eastern approach. It's from Townsville across into Darwin. I think exaggerating, there is a tendency across Australia, even in our own population, to exaggerate how much it's developed or come forward, when in actual fact it is incredibly remote. So to go back to your original argument, do I think that it would be easy to stage from Darwin now? Absolutely not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson is that Darwin can be logistically disrupted fairly easily. And I think if we then just look at our recent experience, I think it was in early 2023, there was massive flooding, and there was no fresh food on the shelves of Darwin within about 5 or 6 days. That if you then increase the population of a city with military, well, you need to work out how you're going to supply that effectively, and that will come at a logistic cost. I think it's that simple. Yeah. My other key takeaway is that theoretical warning times evaporate the instant that your adversary attacks. Now, it was the Defence Strategic Update in 2020 that you would have read with me up in Townsville, Todd, that said that the 10-year warning time is no longer relevant. And I suppose we need to look at that and think about what that means, because does that mean that it's now an 8-year warning time, or does that mean that like the 10-year warning time stopped in 2020? Does that mean that we've got a 6-month warning time? What is a warning time? Interestingly, when I was in Japan last year, they find out the concept of a warning time completely foreign to them. But they've also got 2 Patriot missile batteries out the back of their Ministry of Defence, and Russell has 2 AFP guys on bikes. And that's not to denigrate them. That's to highlight that there's a different situation that the 2 countries find themselves in. But if America thought that they would have time to build up after an initial Japanese attack on the Philippines, that's not what happened. They went through a period of improvisation before they were able to strike back effectively, and that also means that you're on the strategic defence, which democracies seem to find themselves on often. But the strategic defence means tactical defeat, as we've seen through Rabaul, Ambon, Timor, Singapore, etc. So how does an army deal with defeat? How does a military deal with the defeat and then come back from it?
And how long does it take, I suppose? Yeah. To go back to your, like the argument before, 74 days from Pearl Harbour to the assault on Darwin, 74 days. Takes us longer than that to plan out like major exercises by a significant amount. And that's in our own sort of space. Do you know what I mean? And obviously governance and stuff is another thing to talk about. But 74 days, the gravity of that. And I think that's been the common thread throughout all these episodes, is that it is so fast and puts such on the back foot. And those, again, you can't clear those assumptions that you make with little warning time.
Yeah, no, 100%. So I don't know if you remember, I think you need to be personally prepared for a speed of enemy activity that challenges your ability to adapt, to simply process it, right? And the only way I think you can prepare, and this is sort of getting back to, I guess, one of DCA's points, is to read, understand what people have been through before, so that in those moments you have a reference point. Because every other reference point is taken from you through 74 days of enemy action that you didn't anticipate the character of. I think that's absolutely critical, which is, I guess, why we're doing these podcasts, right?
So talk about those, the decisions made by commanders at certain points. Yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I think to bring it back, like the bombing of Darwin was huge for the Darwin community, and like many fled during the time, but it's still sort of every year it's like signified by the day being bombing of Darwin. But 102 Field Battery predominantly, but from 812 Regiment allocate a number of 105mm artillery to fire in support of the demonstration that happens up there. 75 Squadron, the Magpies up in down in Catherine, they commit normally F-35s for a fast air sort of strafe along the along the buildings and along where I just spoke about, along Mitchell Street, and then out to the water. Then we have the ARH or attack armed reconnaissance helicopters up in Darwin from the 1st Aviation Squadron, Correction Regiment, also fly in support and fly super low along Darwin City. It's an absolutely awesome event to go to, but I think that battle, having been there a couple of times, that it's not even the gravity of what would have happened, but you can still feel it shakes the ground and like absolutely gives you some sense of what hell would have been like being attacked on that day. And it happens every year. So if anyone can get up there to watch it, it's absolutely awesome. But I suppose that talks to the bombing Darwin, not specifically the bombing itself, but more so why Darwin was important or perceived to be important, and how difficult it would be to fight from remote locations. To make the assumption that it's going to be significantly easier now is fallacy, I think. But
yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that it is commemorated in the way that it is an indicator that out of 100,000 or over 100,000 war dead that Australia has suffered through every campaign and every war, it's only, I mean, there's a smattering of other casualties, but it's Darwin that actually is the only place on Australian soil where we have lost significant amounts of people out of that 100-odd thousand.
The largest attack at home.
Well, yeah, I mean, like people point to Broome being attacked. That's true. It was Townsville twice, but I mean, the raids on Townsville were by like a single Mavis bomber that missed. Whereas there was nowhere else that copped 240 veteran flyers with aircraft that way outclassed anything that Australia or in fact America had at the time, and certainly outnumbered them in Darwin at that time as well. So I think that it's appropriate that it's commemorated. I think it's somewhat ironic that 75 Squadron essentially played the role of the Japanese, but anyway. I'll leave that. You might want to cut that.
Yeah. So I suppose that's Darwin in itself, more so the largest attack on home soil, and the strategic conditions around trying to fight remotely, I suppose. That was absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
No worries. Hey, and I want to, I think we talk about what we're going to do next, and we haven't discussed this. I reckon we do Milne Bay.
Yeah, okay.
Because there's been too much negativity in our lives. Milne Bay is a story where we strike back.
We always seem to come to the peak of pessimism, I suppose. Don't we, at the end of
it's not as bad as Rabaul, where we basically had to cuddle afterwards to make sure we were okay. But look, I think we do Milne Bay. It is a fantastic example of integrated campaigning, and I feel like in those first episodes when I didn't realise that I was going to be a regular co-host, I just tried to jam too much stuff in. So let's spend some time on Milne Bay.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, sir.
No worries, mate. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.